parliamentary colleagues, legal experts on human rights, and representatives of the Iranian Resistance Movement, the NCRI. And we will be considering what the United Kingdom can and should be doing to support the global campaign for justice for the victims of the 1988 massacre of 30,000 political prisoners in Iran. The 1988 massacre is often referred to as the world's worst crime since the Second World War, and is recognized by NGOs and some legal experts as an ongoing crime against humanity. In order to obtain a better understanding of the magnitude of human suffering it's caused, we've invited some family members of the victims and former political prisoners who have survived the mass executions to give us a first-hand account of their personal experiences today. Recent headline news on Iran concerns the UN Security Council's failure to extend the weapons embargo against the regime, and the issue of whether international sanctions should be reimposed on Tehran because of its breach of key restrictions contained in the nuclear deal, the JCPOA. These two issues, together with the alarming human rights situation in Iran, are matters of serious concern for the international community, including, of course, the United Kingdom. But I believe that we have now arrived at the moment where expressions of concern about the regime's unacceptable behavior are not a sustainable policy. For far too long, the regime in Iran has escaped accountability and acted unacceptably both within Iran itself and abroad. You don't need to be an expert or a politician or a diplomat to understand that allowing an oppressive theocratic regime that has on its record the mass execution of 30,000 political opponents and the sponsorship of international terrorism to buy weapons on the open market from equally oppressive regimes around the world will very probably end in disaster. The issue of accountability, and that means ending impunity for regime officials in Iran, is an important part of the process of stopping Tehran's malign regional activities and its pursuit of nuclear weapons. And that issue is central to our discussions today. The need for an independent international inquiry into the 1988 massacre and the prosecution of those responsible for the crime, as well as the extension of the weapons embargo, has widespread cross-party support in both houses of the British Parliament and among legislators in other European parliaments. In this regard, the British Committee for Iran Freedom has parliamentarians from over 15 European and Arab countries for these demands, calling on the international community to act. Colleagues, we need action at UN level on the question of the 1988 massacre. An opportunity to take that action is the expected UN resolution on Iran, condemning human rights violations in the country, which will be voted on later this year in the Third Committee of the UN General Assembly and then in the General Assembly itself. As one of the principal sponsors of that resolution on Iran, the UK must work with allies to make sure that this year's resolution calls for and secures an international independent investigation into the massacre and establishes a subsequent international accountability mechanism to prosecute those who are found responsible. The British government has the backing it needs to take these actions. The call for an independent international investigation into the massacre has strong support among the Iranian people, among the Iranian diaspora, and among international parliamentarians, and has the extension of the weapons embargo and the reimposition of the UN Security Council resolution on Iran. The international community must now act on the three major concerns with regard to Iran: its human rights violations, its destabilizing activities in the Middle East region, and its nuclear and ballistic missiles program. Repeatedly over the last 40 years, the UN has sadly failed to hold the regime to account. But today we are echoing the call of the NCRI's President-elect, Mrs. Maryam Rajavi, to urge the UK government to lead the international effort and work with its allies to end impunity for the regime and its officials by extending the weapons embargo, reimposing all UN Security Council resolutions, and securing an independent international inquiry into the 1988 massacre. I have, colleagues, had a message from Mrs. Maryam Rajavi, who has asked me if I will please read it out to you. So I do so now. Honourable members of Parliament, distinguished personalities, fellow compatriots and supporters of the NCRI, thank you for holding this important conference on the Iranian people's human rights. I would also like to express my gratitude to prominent members of both houses of Parliament in the UK, political dignitaries and human rights advocates for standing with the Iranian people and resistance. Dear friends, Amnesty International published a shocking report last week about Iran, entitled Trampling Humanity. The report explained the inhuman treatment of those arrested during the November 2019 uprising. It said that at least 7,000 were arrested during the protests, also explaining the details of the tortures inflicted on the prisoners. The extent of the savagery, before anything else, indicates that the regime has failed to put out the flames of resistance, despite massive crackdown and killing of at least 1,500 people in November. Recently, in another inhuman measure, the clerical regime issued death sentences and long prison terms for 3 brothers for taking part in anti-regime protests. Naveed Afkari, a national sportsman, was sentenced to double executions after suffering cruel tortures. These days also mark the 32nd anniversary of the 1988 massacre of more than 30,000 political prisoners in Iran. The vast majority of the victims were members and supporters of the PMOI. As Baroness Boothroyd once said, this is the greatest unpunished crime against humanity since World War II. The international community, including Europe, turned a blind eye on this great crime because they wanted to appease the mullah's tyranny for petty economic interests. So they ignored the values and principles for which millions of Europeans and others sacrificed their lives. Inaction vis-à-vis this regime, and worse, unity of action to lift the arms embargo, undermines human values. To put an end to the crimes of the regime and to counter its warmongering actions in the region, the following steps are necessary. Firstly, an international fact-finding mission must be set up to seek justice for the victims of the 1988 massacre and hold the perpetrators of this grave crime against humanity accountable. And secondly, the UN Security Council must address the terrible situation of human rights in Iran. The Security Council must send to Iran an international delegation accompanied by representatives of the Iranian resistance. They must visit the regime's medieval prisons, visit the prisoners, and particularly meet those arrested during the November 2019 uprising. And thirdly, as the Iranian resistance has called for just a few hours after signing of the JCPOA, the 6 UN resolutions must be reimposed, and all sanctions on weapons sales to Iran must also be reimposed. Supporting the Iranian people's desire to overthrow the regime ruling Iran is necessary for peace and stability in the region. In conclusion, I would like to extend my gratitude to you as elected representatives of the people of Britain and as the UK's elite for persisting on your just positions over the years in defense of the legitimate right of the Iranian people and resistance to struggle for freedom and for persisting on the need to adopt a firm policy against the mullahs. God bless you all. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is Mrs. Rajabi's statement.